All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining. Really great to have you here today. My name is Joy O'Keefe. I'm an associate professor and extension wildlife specialist with the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. I study bats, and I have been doing that for about the past quarter of a century. So I'm going to talk to you today about some critical bat habitat in the form of roosts, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about providing natural roosts for bats and consider artificial roosts as well. I've got a video here of some Indiana bats exiting a dead tree down in southern Illinois. So why is it important to consider bats? Well, I'm going to give you a few reasons why bats are important. One is that many of them are imperiled. Pictured here is a northern long-eared bat, which is a bat that used to be one of our more common species to encounter in Illinois and throughout most of the eastern United States. But because of disease, white nose syndrome, we've seen a pretty dramatic decline in their populations, and they're actually incredibly difficult to capture now. So even our common species can become uncommon relatively quickly. And so for that reason, it's really important that we get a handle on, what are the habitat needs of bats, and where are they? How many are they? And it's actually a really challenging question to answer as to how many bats there are. We do know how many species we have in Illinois. We have 13. There's two occasional that will show up that are pictured over on the right side of the screen, the Seminole bat and the Brazilian free-tailed bat. But the rest of them are on the left side. And of course, like most species groups in Illinois, diversity increases as you go south. We have a lot of karst features, rocky features down in the southern part of the state, as well as abundant forest. And then the proximity to the Mississippi River Valley means that we start to pick up a few species that are kind of our southerly species. So there's quite a few bats as you go south, but even in northern Illinois, you can routinely encounter 4 or 6 species of bats in any location. Now, all of our bats in Illinois are arthropodivorous, and I say arthropodivorous instead of just insectivorous because there are some bats that eat spiders. On the right side of the screen here, you see a pallid bat, which is a western bat species not found in Illinois, eating a centipede. And that's just indicative of that bats are pretty opportunistic predators. They will take what they find, and so that can include spiders, and we especially find some of our smaller bats eating spiders. We don't know much about how they encounter them. They may be picking them up off the ground, or they may be plucking them out of webs. But bats will eat what they can find that is nutritious. And when we do a diet analysis to find out what bats are eating, we find that the primary prey items fall into usually the Diptera, which are the flies, the true flies, the beetles or Coleoptera, and then the Lepidoptera or moths. But occasionally bats will also eat other things like bugs. So pictured here are 5 different prey items that we detected in the diets of 2 species of bats, the northern long-eared bat and the Indiana bat. And in this case, we did a molecular analysis. So when we catch the bats, they readily give us their guano or poop. They'll drop it in a bag or they'll drop it on us. And we plop that into a tube, take it back to the lab, extract the DNA, and then blast that DNA against the barcode of life database where people who are studying various arthropods are depositing their DNA sequences as they study them. And so we can then do a matching game and figure out what it is that the bats are eating. And these 2 bat species preyed primarily on these top 5 groups, which is the crane flies. Those are the big bumbling relatives of mosquitoes that don't bite people, but that are probably pretty easy for bats to capture. Mosquitoes were second on the list, although we don't think the bats are really good at controlling mosquito populations. Bats will opportunistically take mosquitoes, and there's plenty of them out there. Beetles were third. These 2 small bats are primarily eating small prey items, so beetles and moths that are under 10 millimeters in length. And the moths then fall into the micro Lepidoptera. So we're talking about tiny moths, but still sometimes damaging to our forest plants. Some of the moths that we detected were oak rollers, oak leaf rollers. And then leafhoppers are the fifth group, and leafhoppers are a type of true bug that has piercing mouth parts, and some of them will pierce leaves and suck the juices out. So as you can see, three of these species are insects that can damage our crops or our forests or both. And then the mosquitoes, of course, are pests of humans. So bats are doing us a really valuable service by eating these various types of insects. And so that's another reason that it's important to study and to obviously protect and conserve our bat populations. We think that bats are likely vital to pest control in agriculture, more so, in my opinion, at the small scale. When we look around the landscape in Illinois, you see vast fields of corn and soy, and it's tempting to think that bats might be able to help control crop pests in those systems. But some of those fields are just too big for most of our bats to want to cross. It's not that they couldn't, they can fly that far, but they just would rather be closer to tree lines. And thus, it would be important from a conservation perspective to add more trees to our agricultural landscapes. Now, that's easier said than done, but in small scale crop systems, like in vineyards or orchards, we do see that bats can provide really valuable ecosystem services, and this is true around the world. So I think we need to do a little bit more work in this area, but we have demonstrated through diet analysis that bats are important to these systems. Now, we were curious also if bats could, if their value to forests could be demonstrated. And so my student, Liz Bilkey, who is a PhD student and then a postdoc in my lab, conducted this really great experiment where we excluded bats from a part of the forest. So what she did is, if you look at the top right side of the screen, you'll see her control plot and her bat excluded plot. And during the day, the control plot and the bat excluded plot both allowed birds access, right? So she would go to the bat excluded plots in the morning and open up these curtains of netting to allow birds to access the plot. Then in the afternoon, late afternoon, early evening, she would go and close these curtains, thereby excluding bats from the bat excluded plot. And so then we were able to attribute the ecosystem services that we detected just to bats. And what we found here, if you look at the graph on the bottom, is that where bats were excluded, we saw 5 to 6 times more defoliation of the leaves of small saplings in the plot. This was typically oaks and hickories. So you see more defoliation on the leaves, meaning that bats had been eating pests that would have otherwise eaten those saplings. This effect was actually stronger for oaks than for hickories. So looking at plots or panels B and C in the graph, you can see that there's more distance between the mean values for the oaks than there is for the hickories. And what that shows is that bats are even more important for oaks, probably because oaks lack some of the natural chemical defenses that hickories have. Now, back on the mosquito front, because this is a question I always get, is, can we use bats to control mosquitoes? Well, probably not, but that doesn't mean that they're not eating them and that it wouldn't be good to have them around as part of a healthy part of our ecosystem. So looking at these two species of bats, we've got the little brown bat on the left and the big brown bat on the right. Big brown bat's at least twice the size of the little brown bat. And as expected, the bigger bat eats fewer species of mosquitoes. Mosquitoes are very tiny and not great price for such a large bat. In fact, my colleague Justin Boyles calculated that a big brown bat would have to eat mosquitoes for 25 hours a day in order to satisfy its energetic needs, which of course is impossible. So big brown bats are not going to focus on mosquitoes, but both species are eating mosquitoes and probably varying when they're eating mosquitoes across the summer as different types of mosquitoes become available. Now, some critical things we need to know about bats in order to understand their ecology. I want to share with you a few things that are kind of critical traits. One is that most bats give birth to just one pup per year. So they have really low reproductive rates. And you may be familiar with the term in German, Germans call bats die Fledermaus, meaning the flying mouse. But bats are very different than mice, and this is one of the key ways, right? Bats do not give birth to very many young. They have what we call a really slow life history strategy. So the bat that gives the most or gives birth to the most pups in Illinois would be the eastern red bat, coming in at 4 pups on well, not on average, probably as a max, but most of our cave dwelling bats that have really conservative lifestyles, spending a large portion of the year in hibernation, they will actually only give birth to 1 pup per year. Couple that with the fact that bats live unusually long lives for their size, and you've got bats kind of operating more like people than they do like rats, right? They're living a long time. They're giving birth to few young. So our longevity records in North America are for little brown bats, which is a species of Myotis bat that has been documented at 18 to 25 years in the literature and actually 32 years anecdotally. In Russia, there's a record for 41 years for another species of Myotis. So we determined this by putting bands on the bats, and you can see this Indiana bat in the picture has a little bracelet on its wrist. That is a forearm band that has a unique ID. And if we recapture that individual, then we're able to determine its age, or at least the time since it was last banded. In addition to living long lives and giving birth to very few young, another important critical aspect of bats is that they're extremely faithful, returning to the same spots on the landscape year after year. So just this weekend, I was in a mine in southern Illinois surveying for bats to count them as they hibernate during the winter. And we knew exactly where to go to find the cluster of Indiana bats on the ceiling because they're always in the same place on the ceiling every time we go into that mine. They are very faithful as a group and as individuals. On the right side here, you see an eastern red bat roosting in the foliage of a cedar tree. We have detected through foraging telemetry, where we track bats while they're out flying around at night, that eastern red bats have incredibly small foraging ranges during the summer, using just a handful of acres as they fly around catching insect prey. And my student Liz, the same one that did the exclosure study, tracked one eastern red bat female for 2 summers in a row. Again, we knew which one it was because we had put a band on her wrist. And she found that the foraging home range of this bat overlapped by 99% from one year to the next, meaning that basically she foraged in the exact same place from year to year, which is pretty incredible. So we need to keep this in mind when we're thinking about forest habitat protection for these bats, because they are coming back to these same spots over and over. So our bats in North America face at least 3 critical threats. One, of course, being a threat to all species, which is habitat loss. So much of Illinois pre-settlement was actually prairie, but there was a fair amount of forest, of course, associated with our streams. And we still have forest in our riparian zones, but it is dramatically altered, right? We've mostly cut down the historical forest, and it has regenerated, but not to the same structural traits that we would like for bats and for other wildlife, and not necessarily to the same species composition either. And then there's, of course, always pressures on our forests for removal for various development projects. And that's something we have to keep an eye on with bats because they are so faithful. As I mentioned, wind energy, well, I may not have mentioned it, but wind energy is a big threat to bats. This is problematic for our migratory bats in particular. So some of our bats don't hibernate during the winter, but instead fly south to somewhere. We actually don't know exactly where they go, and we're working on trying to determine that through radio telemetry. But these bats are encountering wind turbines, which we're increasingly putting up on the landscape. And for our migratory bats, this is a real issue. We are seeing thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of bats being killed each year. And this is something that we've got to get a handle on, because these migratory bats, we don't know that their populations can sustain these losses for too much longer. The last threat I want to mention is disease, and in particular, the disease white nose syndrome, which is killing bats while they are hibernating. This is a disease caused by a non-native invasive fungal organism that we think came from Europe or Asia, was brought to the US around 2006, 2007, started to spread up and down the Appalachian Mountain chain, then moved west across North America, and is now found in almost every state. And is problematic for cave hibernating bats wherever it occurs. It causes them to wake up, burn through their fat reserves, and they end up starving during the winter because there is, of course, nothing to eat to replenish their fat reserves. And this has been devastating to cave hibernating bats, killing millions of bats, probably upwards of 10 million now, although we've stopped kind of tracking the numbers so well as it's progressed across the country. So where does that put us with regards to our bat populations? Well, in Illinois, we have three federally endangered species. The Indiana bat, which has been listed as endangered since the inception of the Endangered Species Act. The gray bat, which has been listed since 1976. Both of those species are on their way to recovery. And in fact, the gray bat is set to be delisted because of protections at their hibernation sites, which are caves. But the northern long-eared bat was listed as federally threatened and then upgraded to endangered due to impacts from white nose syndrome. And the little brown bat and the tricolored bat are also they're candidates for listing right now to endangered status because of declines from white nose syndrome. Then we have our migratory bats, and there are actually three species that are heavily impacted by wind turbines, but these are the two top species. And so these migratory bats are flying probably across the continent, but again, we don't know the exact pathways that they're using, and then encountering these wind turbines as they go. And we're seeing pretty devastating losses in them. And these are bats that used to be very common bats in the forest during the summer. So what can we do for these bats? I want to talk through a common solution that a lot of folks propose for bat conservation, and then I want to talk more about the role of forests, which is really important and, of course, pertinent to this group. So I study bat boxes quite a lot, and the reason I study bat boxes is because I knew that they were considered a surrogate for trees, and I was already studying bats that were roosting in trees. But when I started studying bat boxes back in about 2015, I realized that we just didn't know very much about how to make them good for bats and that they did have some issues. So I want to talk through what some of those issues are and then, as I mentioned, move over to trees. So sorry, my slide got messed up here, but many boxes like the ones pictured here are too small or they're too dark. Often they're painted black or they're poorly made. So the one on the left side of the slide here has pretty small dimensions. It's only about 15 inches from top to bottom. So not very much thermal mass, which means it's not going to be able to retain heat at night. And then it's also going to gain heat really rapidly during the day. So it's likely to overheat when bats are using it. And then the one pictured in the center is made out of plywood. And this box is very attractive to squirrels because there's glue in the plywood that they like to chew on. And so they basically just dismantled this box. So that makes it not a very good structure for bats. Now, small, dark, and uninsulated boxes can be either too hot, too cold, or both for bats. So let me give you an example of what that looks like here. Looking on the right side of the screen at the graph, you will see that we have temperature in degrees Celsius along the y-axis, and then time in hours since midnight on the x-axis. And around 5 or 6 a.m., you see that all the boxes that were tested in this study, which was done in Germany, look the same. They're all basically sitting around 12 degrees Celsius or 11 degrees Celsius. But then when the sun starts to rise, the black box that is sun exposed, meaning it's receiving full sun, just like the one pictured at left, is really going to rapidly rise in temperature. And by midday, it's already up to almost 45 degrees Celsius, which would be a lethal temperature for the bats inside. And if we sustain temperatures inside that box like that for a period of time, it's going to be really dangerous to bats. Whereas the white box that's deployed in sun is much cooler, and then the two boxes that are deployed in shade are even cooler, basically representing the outside air temperature or ambient temperature. So where we put boxes makes a big difference to how they perform and how dangerous they can be for bats. And my colleague Stephen Griffiths discovered this in Australia when he went back to visit a dark green box he had put up on the side of a tree for a previous study and found 30 dead pups inside it. This box had gotten too much solar exposure, and it was fatal to the pups inside, which couldn't regulate their temperature very well in the heat. So we have some other concerns about bat boxes too. And they're not popping up for me here, but I'll just talk through them. So one is that oftentimes bat boxes are deployed in poor habitat. I receive calls from people around the state, but oftentimes in metropolitan areas asking, can I put a bat box up on the side of my house? And if I ask for a pin drop, like, can you show me where you live? I don't see a tree in sight. That's not a good place to put a bat house, right? We need foraging habitat for the bats to use. And so that's true also of this mowed field here in central Illinois where this bat box is deployed. Another concern is that bat boxes may make bats more susceptible to predators or to parasites. And as an example, on the bottom right, you see the inside of a bat box that we dissected and took apart. And we knew what we were going to find, but it was still unfortunate to see just hundreds. In one case, one box had 1,000 bat bugs, which are parasites that will prey on bat blood. And this is dangerous for the bats because they will come back to these structures and encounter these parasites, and they'll be problematic for their pups as well. So for that reason, I say that bat boxes have some issues that we can't really resolve, even if we can overcome some of the microclimate issues. And it would be better to think about other solutions for our bat conservation. In addition to that, bat boxes are only going to be used by a handful of our bats. So I circled in white 4 species in Illinois that we know will routinely use bat boxes, including the big brown bat, the endangered Indiana bat, the little brown bat, and the evening bat. But most of our other bat species do not use bat boxes. And bat boxes, of course, don't provide foraging habitat in of themselves. So what can we do if we want to provide habitat for bats and protect more of our bat species in Illinois? Well, of course, we can protect forests and we can manage for larger tracts of forest, more connected patches of forest that allow bats to traverse the state, to move around as they forage for insects. And they're going to receive a lot of benefit from this. Forests are really valuable to bats in a number of ways. For one, trees serve as roosts for bats, and I'll show you a few examples of that. Bats can use any number of structures on trees, and different species use them in different ways. Forests, of course, provide a lot of plant material and leaf litter to feed insects and other arthropods, which then provides food for the bats. And then forest patches will provide shelter from weather extremes, such as extreme heat, and also extreme inclement weather like storms. So these are really valuable places for bats to hang out, and we know that too, and we all probably really like being in a forest. When we track bats at night, we find that they forage where they roost in forests. So pictured at left are 2 maps showing the foraging ranges of 2 different species of bats that my PhD student Tim Dival tracked. So on top is the northern long-eared bat. And you can see the little blue dots represent ponds on the landscape where we capture the bats. And almost certainly we captured the bat at one of those 2 ponds that's contained within the little blob, the polygon blob, which represents the space where the bat foraged. And then the tree symbols, of course, represent the trees that the bat used. Indiana bat, Myotis sodalis, is the one pictured on the bottom. And this bat, even though it's almost the same size as the northern long-eared bat, has a bigger foraging range. It tends to go a little bit farther astray from its roosts, but you can see that it still uses a blob of space around the roost trees that it's using, and then goes off probably to search for patches of flies it particularly likes to eat over on the west side. So these bats are using this landscape, which is heavily forested. This is an area that we work in southern Indiana. When we track bats to see where they're foraging, we find that regardless of species, we've actually tracked 4 different species while they're foraging at night, and found that they all tend to roost and forage close to openings, close to roads, which are these small forest roads that go through the understory and have canopy above them, and close to ponds like this one, which is, of course, also where we go to catch these bats. So when we're thinking of critical features in a forest, these are some to manage for. What do their roost trees look like? Well, as I mentioned, it varies by species. So over on the left side of the screen, you see a dead snag, as we call it, a dead tree standing with a lot of sloughing bark still attached to the trunk. And this tree actually still has most of its height, which is kind of unusual in my experience. It's in an area that has been harvested on the state forest land where we work in southern Indiana. And they left some dead trees standing. And sometimes trees are damaged during harvest operations and then are left standing, or other times trees are intentionally killed. And I'll show you an example of that later. And either way, these trees can be valuable as roosts for bats. So this is an example of a tree that would be used by the endangered Indiana bat, which likes to form colonies under the sloughing bark of dead trees like this, and could be numbering in the tens to even a couple hundred bats on a tree like this. In the middle, you see a giant beech tree that is alive but has cavities in the trunk, little spout holes that are wounds, probably from some form of heart rot. And these beech trees turn out to be really valuable roosts for the big brown bat, which is a bat that we commonly think of as an anthropogenic bat. It likes human-made structures, including houses, barns, church attics, and bat boxes. But when we tracked it in the forest for 2 years, we only found one human-made roost, which is the barn on the right side. You see a big brown bat with a band on its wrist in the barn where we tracked it, and we found it roosting with 80 of its friends and also a bunch of goats. This was a barn that was home to goats and a place that did goat yoga. So after 2 years of tracking, almost all of our big brown bat roosts were trees like that beech tree. Then for the eastern red bat, you can see a red bat with its pups attached to its belly, hanging from a greenbrier plant in the middle of the forest, not far off the forest floor. So keep an eye out when you're walking through the forest. You never know where you might encounter a red bat. And this is not exactly a roost tree, but oftentimes red bats will use oaks or hickories or other large-leaved trees, and you can see an oak leaf right over this bat, providing her with a little bit of shade while she's roosting during the summer. When we look at where they roost relative to the forest, in this particular managed forest, we found that female bats in particular really like to be in some area with solar exposure. And you can see this graph shows the proportion of roosts that were in clearings versus shelterwood cuts where some of the trees had been removed versus the forest matrix where there's full intact canopy. And we're seeing these females roosting mostly in these clearings, right? And so that's really important because it tells us that as we work to manage forests and to try to restore conditions that were historically there, that species like oak hickory matrix, that we can do that and still provide roosting habitat for these endangered bats. Now, trees provide bats with hiding places and shelter from extreme weather. And we're doing a study. I have an undergrad working on this where we're actually measuring, where we're looking at previous studies around the world where they have measured temperatures inside trees and then the outside air temperature. And this gives us a sense of how trees work in terms of buffering outside air temperatures. And we found that tree cavities will buffer outside air temperatures by as much as 4 degrees Celsius on a hot day and 3 degrees Celsius on a cool day. So for a hot day, a translation would be if it's 95 degrees outside, being inside the tree, the bat would only be experiencing around 88 degrees Fahrenheit. And then on a 41 degree Fahrenheit night, so pretty cool, but not freezing, a tree will be just over 46 degrees Fahrenheit inside. And this can be really energetically valuable to bats. And it's just a demonstration of how trees can actually help bats to survive through some extreme temperatures in a way that, of course, bat boxes cannot. When we study the types of trees that bats are using, we find that tree diameter is actually a really strong predictor of use by bats. You tend to find more bats in larger trees, and you tend to find especially maternity colonies of bats where it's a female or a bunch of females and their pups will be roosting in the biggest trees. So we should just protect and grow large old trees, right? No problem. This is really easy to do. Or is it, right? I think you all recognize that it's rare to see a giant old tree, that those are increasingly rare on the landscape, and that it takes a long time to grow such a tree. So I want to talk through a little bit of our work on that and share with you what we know. So my student, Joey Pettit, who was a PhD student in my lab, actually went out to 3 different study areas in Indiana, New Jersey, and in the southern Appalachian Mountains, where we had a slate of known roost trees used by the endangered Indiana bat in all 3 study areas. And he was able to go, he's actually a dendrochronologist, and so he was able to go and take an increment borer and bore into each tree that he found. Or if the tree had fallen, he would cut a cookie out of the tree with a chainsaw, and then he would sand those down and age the cores or age the cookie that he cut out of the tree. And what he was then able to do is, of course, figure out how old these trees were when they were used. And he could also figure out how old they were when they died. And this is really valuable information for us for thinking about how to manage for Indiana bats. And so we asked the question, does a tree need to be a 200-year-old late successional species, like an oak tree, for bats to use it? And Joe found that no, size was actually a better predictor. So if you look at the graphs on the right, the top graph shows you the maximum number of bats that emerged from the tree on the y-axis, and then on the x-axis, we're looking at the age at use. And it doesn't matter if a tree is 50 years old or 200 years old, there's no strong relationship between age and the number of bats coming out of the tree. However, looking at the panel on the bottom, you'll see the tree diameter along the x-axis, and the larger the tree, the more bats are emerging. And this is a pretty strong pattern in our data, suggesting that we just need to grow big trees. They don't necessarily need to be old trees. So I'll show you a couple of examples from trees that Joe cored in the field. So on the left is a tree that's 31 centimeters in diameter. And then on the right is a tree that's 50 centimeters in diameter, not too different in size. The tree on the left is 31 years old, and the tree on the right is actually 227 years old. And still, these trees actually had very similar numbers of bats coming out of them. So we can grow trees quickly to provide good roosting habitat for bats. And you're probably familiar with some trees that grow quickly, like cottonwoods and maples. These are early successional species that pop up fast when you create an opening and can grow quickly and attain size quickly. Late successional species grow more slowly and take time to gain size. Oftentimes we think of oaks and hickories as being late successional. Some pine trees, like down where we worked in the southern Appalachian Mountains, the shortleaf pine operates as a late successional species. Now, if we have trees standing already and we're doing management in a forest, we can quickly create roost trees by selectively girdling them. And what does that look like? Well, we take a chainsaw and we make a couple cuts in the trunk of the tree to kill it while it's standing. This, of course, is not something anybody who likes trees wants to think about, but if you're in a place where you're harvesting some trees, instead of taking all of the trees, leaving some and killing them where they stand and then letting them die naturally or succeed from there, is going to provide habitat not only for bats, but for woodpeckers, for lizards, for insects, other things that will go and use the spaces under the bark and the cavities that are created in this tree. And it might take a few years, but bats will find these. So here's an example of a girdled roost tree that we tracked bats to that had over 200 bats roosting within this tree, which is a pretty impressive find. And of course, the next year it was unfortunately on the ground, and I'm going to talk more about what that looks like with some of our research in a moment. You can also leave dead trees standing when having trees removed. So for example, leaving a tree standing beside the house if you're having trees removed, or in your yard or in your neighborhood, or modifying snags. So on the right side, you see a couple examples of, well, it's the same tree, but the faceplate was removed and then grooves were carved within the wood. Then the faceplate was reattached, and what this allowed, this is just a little chainsaw work, allows bats and birds that want to go into a cavity to enter from the bottom and go up into those grooves and find a space to roost. This method has been tried successfully with bats, birds, and gliders, marsupial gliders in Australia. And a colleague of mine in Indiana sent me these pictures because he started using this method at homeowners' properties around Indianapolis. Now, back to Joe's work, I just want to highlight what we found when we looked at tree age and how long does it take to make a good roost tree for Indiana bats. So Joe found that the average roost tree that we studied was around 97 years old. Okay, so that's across both early successional and late successional species. And these trees stood dead for about 7 years before they were used by bats. And then they were on average used for about 4 years before falling. So if we're thinking about managing a forest and we want to, have a steady supply of bat roost trees for bats to use, such as in the picture here, you want to have that forest in the background, able to sustain bats long past we're gone, right? So you're going to have to think about having a mix of both early successional and late successional species to sustain those bats and hope that there's going to be some natural disturbances that are going to come along and kill some of those trees, whether that's insect pests or it is, a tornado that might pop through or a flood, and create the conditions that allow some of those trees to die, but not all, so that there can still be a ready supply of bats, a ready supply of roost trees for bats on the landscape. Now, another way that we have tackled this is to go back and revisit old trees that bats used and to look at what had happened to them since the bats had used them. So my student Josie Hoppenworth did this for her thesis work, working in southern Indiana. She revisited almost 200 trees that were used by both Indiana bats and northern long-eared bats. And she characterized the condition of the trees as she found them. And she found that one of the prominent predictors of whether or not the tree was still standing, which is what's shown on the x-axis or the y-axis of this graph here. So probability of a snag falling. So there's a higher probability for the bar on the left than there is on the right, is the decay resistance of the tree. So some tree species are more resistant to decay than others, and trees that are resistant to decay are going to last longer as bat roosts. So in particular, in her study, some oaks and sassafras were categorized as decay resistant, whereas maples, poplar, and ash were not decay resistant. And maples and poplars, of course, we think of as early successional species that are quick to colonize after and a stand is opened up. If we remove some trees and create some light, those trees will pop right up. Whereas oaks will take longer to come in. Those are our late successional species. And so again, what you're seeing here is kind of a balance of you need to have both. So you can get those trees that grow up quickly and provide roosts in the short term, but they're not going to last as long as these older late successional trees that have taken longer to attain girth, but then are more resistant to decay and less likely to fall quickly. So we got to couple those two things together when we're managing forests for bats in order to sustain roosts for them. So I want to close with some takeaway messages. First, I hope I convinced you that bats are important and that they are imperiled. Second, that they're long-lived and they are faithful to their habitat, returning year after year. And that forests are crucial to bats, especially big trees, but we can attain big trees in a number of different ways. And that creating natural roost trees is going to be better for bats than offering them artificial roosts because, of course, they're going to benefit not only from the properties of the tree itself, but also from their situation being in a forest condition, which offers foraging habitat and shelter for these bats and alternate roost trees to go to. So I hope that you're thinking about forests as being really valuable for bats now. So I want to thank all the folks that have helped me along the way with all the work that we do. And I do have a couple of websites. I have a QR code here for one on making bat boxes safer, because as I mentioned, we do a lot of research on bat boxes. But you're welcome to reach out to me at the email address there if you have any questions about bats that we don't get answered today. I would be happy to interact with you and answer questions about bats or other wildlife at any time. So thank you very much, and I'll let Kinsey take it back.
Thank you so much, Joy. That was awesome. So it's 1:42, which gives us 15 to 20 minutes to answer everyone's questions. So Joy, I don't know if you noticed, but a lot of people have been dropping some questions in the Q&A. And if you are able to pull that up, I think that's a good place to start answering questions. So if anybody else has any questions, head to the Q&A option in the taskbar on Zoom, and that's where you can throw in any questions for Joy, and she'll get to them as she runs through them.
Sure. So the first question I saw is white nose syndrome still a problem? And it definitely is. Although in some places, what we're seeing is that bats are uh, becoming kind of resilient to the disease. So the bats that are remaining, which is a lot fewer bats than what we started with, are showing some resistance in some places. We're not still seeing bats dying. So there does seem to be some genetic aspect to this, and folks have detected a few genes that seem to allow bats to survive better, but also bats are showing some behavioral changes, which maybe is again genetic, just bats having different inclinations. But it turns out that bats that like to cuddle together with other bats in large numbers may not be doing as well in certain habitats. And so bats that tend to go off on their own may be more likely to survive. But we do still see, like in the Midwest, large numbers of bats. I'll be in a mine next week in Missouri surveying, and we routinely see groups of 400 bats or so, and those bats are doing okay. So there's also characteristics of the sites themselves that are allowing bats to sustain. And we're still gaining a better understanding of that, but it looks like some populations have stabilized in some places. Okay, let's see. Next question. Do I have inklings about what types of research I'd like to conduct to learn more about the types of ecosystem services bats provide? So more diet study is important. We're still doing molecular analyses. I'd like to do more of the exposure type work in small scale agricultural systems to find out how important bats are to controlling crop pests in those systems. And actually, it was just raised to me yesterday. Could we do more to understand how bats are using large scale agriculture and maybe add an agroforestry element if we could have trees, kind of going out into the cornfields. I don't know if that would be a popular option for the corn industry and soy because it does provide shading, which is going to reduce the crops area, but that could bring bats to those fields and then potentially have more of their ecosystem services. So yeah. Next question is, do bats eat lightning bugs? I actually had a colleague that studied that and bats' interaction with lightning bugs. I think lightning bugs generally signal that they're distasteful, and so probably not a ideal prey item for bats. So we haven't detected them during our molecular studies of bats, but that doesn't mean that they wouldn't occasionally encounter one. But once they learn that something is distasteful, they probably would avoid it in the future. Putting a bat house in a half an acre yard, would that attract bats? So definitely check out the website that's linked there, Robin, and you will find tips for putting up bat houses and what sort of bat houses and where to place them. I would need to know a little bit more about the forest condition around your half acre yard. But if there's already forest there, then there's already bats there, right? And they probably already have a place to roost. They don't necessarily need a bat box to be drawn into the area. A good investment, if anybody's really curious about what bats are in your area, is to get a handheld bat detector. There's actually one online that you can purchase called the Magenta. And the Magenta bat detector is unfortunately sold only in Europe, so it's difficult for me to buy them. But but you can buy them pretty easily with your credit card. They allow you to hear the bats as they're foraging at night, and that's a good way to kind of know if bats are already using your area. You may not need a bat detector or a bat house in order to attract bats. How high do migratory bats fly? That's a great question. I have a friend who was in an airplane and flying about a mile up and looked out and saw a bat flying beside him, a free-tailed bat. We don't know exactly the altitude that they'll get to, but there has been a little bit of work on that with free-tailed bats. So for the other species, we don't know, but potentially that high. Um, We do know that we see a lot of deaths of bats at the wind energy sites where the turbine blades are rotating around 80 meters high. And that seems to be an area that bats like to fly. So basically above the treetops, but maybe not too much higher. That is something that we could get more information on with the certain type of trackers that we could put on bats. And we're actually, still hoping, like, the technology is always changing. And as that technology produces smaller and smaller tags that we're going to be able to attach to bats and get that kind of information, then we'll be able to get altitude and other things. How territorial are bats? That does probably depend on the species of bats. Red bats, for example, are known to chase other bats away. Some bats will forage in groups together. So it varies depending on the bat and how colonial they are, I would say. Some bats will actually even eat other bats, like the hoary bat has occasionally been found eating the smallest bat, the tricolored bat that's found in North America. So, they may be trying to get them out of their territory by chasing after them and then end up with them in their mouths. But these are, yeah, we don't know a lot about how territorial they are. It depends probably across species on they're more territorial against other bats than to each other. However, a colleague of mine, Aaron Corcoran, studies bat sounds in flight and how bats interact with insects and also with each other. And he has found that some bats will come in and jam the sounds of other bats so that they can't find their prey. So if a bat's echolocating and it's making its echolocation calls, another bat will come in and make noise to disrupt that signal so that the bat can't get good echoes, and then that bat can take over the airspace and start foraging on the insects. So have I seen projects to include bat crossings near roads or wind energy farms? Yeah, I haven't seen a bat crossing per se. I think that that is definitely possible that bats would use those road crossings. We have a project area near the Indianapolis airport where they built a major highway across the area that the bats were using. And we still continued to see bats crossing the highway, and we don't know exactly where they're crossing, but road crossings can be really dangerous for bats. A colleague in Pennsylvania studied near a colony of bats. They went to the roadside and they were able to find dead bats. There were bats that were living in a church, and they found dead bats on the roadside. So they were being struck by vehicles, and that does suggest that, like, providing some sort of a crossing would be valuable. But convincing bats to use it, I think you might want to put a pond or something up there to, provide even more attractiveness, because they can just cross the road and they might not recognize it's dangerous until they do that. In suburban settings, my number one suggestion for promoting bat populations in suburban settings is to remove non-native invasive species. If you can remove those plants like bush honeysuckle or autumn olive or things that are clogging up the forest understory. Those are creating structural clutter, which is problematic for bats because it makes it harder for them to move through the forest and under the canopy to forage for insects. Also, those plants are impeding the growth of native plants that could be fostering like a great diversity of arthropods for bats to feed on. And so having fewer of those non-native species is going to open up the forest to be better foraging conditions for bats. Of course, it's also going to give opportunities for young tree species or young tree saplings to grow up in the understory and create future roosts for bats. So I definitely think that there's some concern about these non-native invasive species. And every time an Eagle Scout contacts me and says they want to put up bat houses for a project, I say, how about you remove some invasive species instead? Because that's going to have a bigger impact than putting up bat houses. What's the process for measuring how many bats are in a tree cavity? So we find the bats using trees usually by radio tracking them. So we go out and we capture bats during the summer, usually during the summer, and we will glue on a little radio tag to its back that is emitting a frequency that we can hear with a radio receiver. We go out during the day, we track the bat, and sometimes it's very difficult. It takes us several days to find the bat that we have tagged, but we will track it to a tree. And then once we have that tree and we've isolated that, yes, this is the tree, then we will station one or multiple people around that tree at night to watch the bats as they emerge and to count them. And that's usually just done visually, but as I showed you with the video at the very beginning, you can videotape them. You can use infrared light to get a better view of what's happening in the tree. And you can actually use acoustics as kind of um, a surrogate for counting the bats because the number of calls that you record from bats will be indicative of how many bats were there. So once you calibrate that and you find out what that value is, then you can make a kind of a one-to-one or not one-to-one, but whatever the slope of the line is, relationship. If I get this many calls, that means I had this many bats, which a friend of mine does with cave bats in Texas that have caves with hundreds of thousands of bats. So at that point, it gets difficult to count the bats yourself, right? So, but usually what we do is go out. I like to lay on the ground and see if I can get a good case of chiggers, and then watch the tree and see how many bats fly out. And we'll do that a few times, and that gives us a good estimate of how many bats there are. So yeah, somebody asked, white nose syndrome is particularly a problem for cave bats, and that's because this is a cave-loving fungus that likes to grow in cool, moist conditions. It particularly likes temperatures between 12 and 16 degrees Celsius, and it likes moist environments. It is found in caves in Europe and in Asia. And we think that it may have been naturally occurring there. They were not aware of it until we discovered it here. So we discovered it here in North America, New York State, back in 2006 in a cave called Howell's Cavern in New York, near Albany. And then it spread, as I mentioned, up and down the Appalachian Mountain chain. And it's getting bats when they come back to hibernate during the winter. And so those are the bats that I call cave bats. Those bats may use forest for half the year, but the other half the year, or at least 5 months, they're in a cave or a mine, some kind of an underground subterranean structure that keeps temperatures just above freezing. And so it's safe for hibernating. And those bats will drop their body temperature to be just above the outside air temperature in the cave or the mine that they're in. And so they're torpid, they're in deep torpor or hibernation, and their immune system is depressed. This fungus is growing on the cave wall. It then starts to creep over and grow on these bats, and it's necrotic on their wing tissue. It causes damage to the wing tissue, and the bat's immune system will eventually kick in and cause even more damage. So it starts to eat away at the wing tissue, causing holes in the wings. It's called white nose syndrome because it was first detected growing on the face, but that's not really where the problems are. The problem is more so on the wings. And what we found is that these bats are dying from starvation during the winter because of this irritating fungus waking them up, causing them to burn through their fat reserves. And this is not a problem for the bats that don't go into caves because they're not encountering this fungus. So on the hardwood ecosystem experiment, I know we're running close on time, so I just want to say there is a website for this called the He Forest Study. And if you go to He Forest Study, you will find all of the papers that we have published on bats thus far. But the basic conclusions are that bats are able to tolerate and sometimes even benefit from forest management that's occurring there. It's relatively low intensity forest management. And I think we found that the type of work that's being done to promote oak and hickory forests for the future is compatible with managing for even our endangered species of bats. Yeah, this question of losing oaks to herbicide drift, that's really too bad. I don't know if bats will avoid those trees. Like initially they might, but after they die and gain the right structural features, including like getting a lot of sun on the bark, then those bats may start to use them. And I would just go out at sunset. Bats are pretty reliable in emerging from their roosts between 10 and 20 minutes after sunset. So check your phone for the sunset time, go station yourself at the tree and watch, and you will see, what's happening. and if bats are using it. And don't just do it one time, but do it multiple times, and of course on a warm night. So, and if okay, single best thing, a 45-acre rural landowner makes a hardwood forest. I mean, just removing non-native invasives is great, but if you have a stand of trees that you think you could potentially thin some or remove maybe a few maples to just open up, uh, release some of the oaks and hickories to allow them to grow up larger, you're going to be providing good roosting habitat for bats into the future by just promoting those larger trees. But there's just the occasional girdling a tree or felling a tree to create some light conditions is probably enough, and opening up the understory so bats can fly easily. I think I got through them all.
You did. There were just one or two that I think you covered them. There was some in the chat, but I think that was good. Thank you very much. I know Kinsey's got some important information. It was fascinating, Dr. O'Keefe. It was really great. Thank you very much. It was great.
Sure.
Yes, I am going to share my screen as a closeout. Thank you everyone for attending our webinar today. This was the second in our From Canopy to Understory series, and it was a pleasure having Joy here to speak about bats and their critical habitats. We'll have a couple more the rest of this year, so be on the lookout. Check our events page. You can also join our Friends of IFA list if you want to. It's basically an emailing list if you want to hear about upcoming events and our newsletters. You can just head to our website and go to the Join tab to join and get that newsletter and any upcoming event emails. Lastly, if you're interested in the SAF CFEs, you can scan this QR code if you're not on your phone right now. Otherwise, I will send out an email soon after this with a link for you to fill out the form and let me know if you're interested in receiving those credits. So I just want to say thank you again, and I'll pass it off to Trisha.
And that's it. Thanks, everybody. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar series from the Canopy to the Understory. And we want to thank our sponsors, the Illinois Forestry Association and the Morton Arboretum. Thank you very much. I will end the program.